Chapter 090. Change of plans. It wasn't long before the group decided to leave the Sovereign Gate space and return to their bodies outside. Partially this was because the Guardian of the Threshold was gone, leaving them on their own in the silent void. When Panic-Seth ended his interaction with Zorian and others, he took the Guardian he had been possessing along with him. Or maybe he was the Guardian in the end, who could know? Regardless, with the Guardian no longer present, there was little point in them staying there either. The second more important reason was that Silver Lake was gone and they desperately wanted to check if she was outside waiting for them. Although Panic-Seth's statement that someone had already taken his offer and her subsequent disappearance strongly suggested she had betrayed them, Zorian held on to the hope that she had merely left the Sovereign Gate on her own. Somehow, it was a hope that would not last long. Whatever force Panic-Seth had used to stop Zack and Zorian from returning to their body had dissipated with his disappearance, so getting out of the Sovereign Gate was done without incident. Once outside, they found Silver Lake's lifeless body lying on the floor. She was dead. There was no evidence of struggle. No wounds, obvious or subtle. No indication of any sort of foul play from the facility staff or hidden enemies. It was as if her soul simply disappeared from her body all of a sudden, painlessly killing her. It was the same kind of dead that they had already seen in the Arania beneath Cyoria and the other soul-killed individuals they'd come across over the restarts. A grim atmosphere descended upon the group. Zack was so enraged he incinerated Silver Lake's body into ashes before anyone could stop him. Zorian wanted to scold him for destroying critical clues as to what happened, but Alanik placed his hand on his shoulder and shook his head, silently telling him to let it go. Maybe it was better that way. This wasn't the time for starting arguments and they probably got all they would have gotten out of her corpse anyway. They didn't stay in the time magic research facility for long. They needed to talk to everyone about what they had seen and heard about what Panic-Seth had told them in private, but that was best done in the privacy of their base at the Novita estate. However, an issue suddenly rose up when they tried to leave the facility. Apparently, while the facility staff accepted their mysterious orders without complaint, they still paid close attention to everyone coming and leaving from the facility. They knew exactly how many people their group had, and they knew that Silver Lake had suddenly gone missing. That was a surprisingly thorny situation to get out of. Zack was still visibly fuming and looked like he was going to start throwing around fireballs at all these people questioning him where their companion had suddenly disappeared to, but Cranton refused to let the matter drop. Unfortunately, explaining that Silver Lake was dead and that Zack had already incinerated her soulless body was not an option. In the end, Zorian had to memory edit roughly half of the facility personnel to make them forget Silver Lake had ever entered the place that day and then make alterations to the physical records which also kept track of that kind of thing. Strange as that sounded, altering physical records turned out to be a lot harder than editing memories. Those records had some very inventive protections against such tampering, whereas the minds of facility staff were largely unprotected against mental tampering. Still, although the immediate issue was dealt with, Zorian could already see that their headaches in regards to the facility and Silver Lake's presence there were only starting. Silver Lake had been one of the crucial people in regards to their project of turning the Imperial Orb into a better Black Room. The void left by her disappearance was going to be keenly felt in the near future. He still had trouble believing this was actually happening, to be honest. He had fully expected their circumstances to change once they brought the key to the Guardian of the Threshold, but not like this. How could Panic-Seth even contact them through the Guardian? Even if the Sovereign Gate was made from a primordial, that primordial was clearly not Panic-Seth. He of the flowing flesh was imprisoned inside the hole, the massive circular abyss around which Cyoria was built. He had been stuck there since the time the primordials had been sealed away, presumably. The Sovereign Gate, on the other hand, had been primarily used in northern Mycena before its current use. It didn't make sense. How could Panic-Seth infiltrate the time loop mechanism to appear before them? How could he take people out of the time loop? And what had he offered Silver Lake to make her swear some kind of death pact with a godlike primordial entity that considered them useful tools at best? He didn't know. He hoped other people had managed to get something useful out of the primordial, unlike him. Having finally left the facility, the group gathered in the Novita estate. They left people some free time to collect their thoughts and calm down, and then started discussing what happened. The first issue, of course, was Panic-Seth. Or something that claimed to be Panic-Seth anyway. They had no proof that the unknown entity was telling the truth, but then again it had no reason to lie about that either. Identifying as Panic Seth would not set anyone at ease. In any case, talking to the rest of the group confirmed what everyone had suspected by now. Panic Seth had somehow dragged each of them into their own individual space for a private conversation. Everyone except Zack, that is. Zack alone did not merit a meeting with the Primordial, it seemed. While everyone else disappeared into their own private space, Zack was simply left alone in the darkness of the Sovereign Gates area. Even the Guardian of the Threshold was gone, leaving him simply floating in the silent void with no way out until Panic Seth was done with the others. As for the others, they'd all found themselves in front of the warped, twisted Guardian of Threshold, though most did not see the same eye-covered humanoid that Zorian had. In Kieran's case, for instance, the Guardian grew another 2 pairs of arms while his torso split open into a giant vertical mouth lined with predatory teeth. Nora saw the Guardian's limbs lengthen while bone spikes erupted from its head, causing it look like it had a bony sea urchin growing out of its neck. This initial monstrous form was then gradually changed into a more inoffensive human form through a process of constant shapeshifting reminiscent of the one Zorian experienced. After that, though, the experiences of different people wildly diverged. Not all received the offer of making a contract with the Primordial. Taven and Nora were almost completely toyed with, for instance. Panic Seth simply shifted between different forms while occasionally spouting total non-sequiturs like, "I like dogs," or "Your mother would be ashamed of you," seemingly studying their reactions. Daimen claimed that Panic Seth had never offered him anything, instead simply trying to question him about what he knew about Zorian, his likes, motives and preferences. Something that visibly infuriated his older brother. Though Zorian was unsure how much of that was because Panic Seth was basically trying to get him to betray his family and how much it was the fact that Panic Seth clearly didn't see him as important outside of being Zorian's brother. If the situation weren't so dire, Zorian might have been amused about that. It also quickly became clear that even though everyone was reunited at roughly the same time, they did not spend the same amount of time talking to Panic Seth. Some, like Zorian, only interacted with the Primordial for a short while before being dismissed. Others, especially ones that pretended to actually consider its offer, spoke with the entity for quite a while before Panic Seth tired of them. The Primordial employed some kind of time dilation during its interaction with people, lengthening the meeting with ones that seemed like they could be convinced, while spending only a token effort on others. This probably explained how it managed to convince Silver Lake so relatively quickly. If she showed the greatest amount of interest in its offer out of them all, the Primordial would have likely extended her meeting as much as it could. Plus, considering how powerful and experienced Silver Lake was, she was probably considered one of the most prioritized targets to begin with. "Were you not worried that the Primordial was reading your mind?" Zorian asked them, frowning. "I mean, it seemed capable of lifting people's appearances straight out of my head when I talked to it. It was one of the big reasons I was so eager to get out of the meeting as much as possible." "He did no such thing while talking to me," Svim said, shaking his head. "Then again, Panic Seth did not try to copy any people while talking to me. He just shifted from one generic form to another throughout the entire talk." Zorian found it a little interesting how some people like him referred to Panic Seth as it, while Svim and others referred to the Primordial as he. The cultists did call Panic Seth he of the flowing flesh, so one could indeed argue that the entity was male in some sense, but it was debatable how much normal gender applied to a monstrous shape-changer like that. The entity assumed a female form when speaking to him, male form in front of others, and an Arania form when speaking to the Arania. It clearly thought little of such things. "I actually did ask the thing about that when it tried to shapeshift into Kana," Kale said, pausing slightly. "Well, more like I blew up at it and demanded an explanation. Sparingly, it actually gave me one. It said no mind reading was taking place. It was just watching everything we did inside the time loop and taking note of people close to us. That's probably why it tried to convince me while looking like Kana instead of Namra, even though the latter would probably be more effective. Since my wife had died long before the start of the time loop, Panic Seth had no idea what she looked like, and thus couldn't copy her appearance." "Yes, that is what he said to me as well," Ilsa said. "He tried to tempt me with the secrets of true creation and I asked how he knew about that. He said the same thing he had to Kale, but he also expanded on it a little bit. Panic Seth claims the Sovereign Gate is not made from a primordial like we thought. It is more like an attachment or maybe a shell, which must be bonded to a specific primordial in order to work. This can potentially be any primordial, but currently it's Panic Seth. That's why he could appear in front of us like that, Zack said gloomily. Yes, Ilsa said, nodding. The Sovereign Gate somehow twists the primordial in question into the time loop as we know it. In a very real sense, Panic Seth is the time loop, which means he is aware of everything that occurs inside of him. So Panic Seth is watching us even now? Taven said, sounding disturbed. Probably, Ilsa shrugged. She seemed to take the idea in stride. Or maybe she just had more time than the rest of them to come to terms with it. Zorian was personally very disturbed by this discovery. How were they supposed to subvert the time loop mechanism in order to leave this place, if the time loop was basically a sapient being that was always watching them? It was quite likely that Panic Seth could actively sabotage any escape attempt it did not like. Perhaps it was limited by the safeguards built into the Sovereign Gate, but those safeguards probably wouldn't protect people like him who were trying to break the system. No wonder Panic Seth claimed he was never leaving this place without its help. Back then, Zorian thought that meant without its help, but perhaps what Panic Seth really meant was without its approval. If he is that all-knowing, I wonder why he had not been more effective at tempting us, Svim mused. One would think he would have a far better grasp on our character if it could perceive everything we did so far. Awareness is not necessarily total awareness, Orisa offered. I am technically aware of everything my bees do, but if you were to ask me about one particular bee, there is only so much I could tell you. The various elementals we consulted did say that primordials view us all like animals, maybe even mere bugs, Zack said. How much do you really understand the sparrows living in the city or ants digging up your garden? We may be greater than them, but they are still alien to us. Hell, Zorian can read their minds and memories, and he still has trouble leading them from place to place without using any magical coercion. You're talking about that one time he tried to literally herd cats, right? Kale said, smiling slightly. I remember that one. It wasn't a serious attempt, Zorian complained. It was just an amusing idea I had when I was bored. This isn't the time for this, Alanik said, a little annoyed. Zack brings up a good point with primordials seeing us all as animals. You don't discuss things with animals, you manipulate them into doing what you want. We should be wary of trusting that creature too much. Although there is probably some glimmer of truth in what it's saying, I suspect it is willing to say anything, true or false, if it thinks doing so will increase its chances of escaping its prison. I don't know. He seemed pretty honest and forthright to me, Ilsa said, looking at Alanik. Clearly you also thought there was some value in listening to it, since you were one of the people that managed to engage it in a lengthy conversation. What did you speak about, then? Ultimately, only a few people managed to keep their cool and get something substantial out of Panic Seth. Alanik, Svim, Orisa, Ilsa, Kiran and an Arania named Night Dream were the only ones that managed to interest Panic Seth enough for him to engage them in a lengthy back and forth. It made Zorian a little self-conscious to realize he had essentially bungled that meeting. He might have gotten some important answers out of the primordial if he had been a little better at acting. Then again, were these people really so good at acting, or were they actually somewhat tempted by Panic Seth's offer, and the primordial could sense that in their exchange? He could tell that Ilsa, at the very least, was lying when she claimed she had only been pretending to be interested in the primordial's offer. The others were harder to read. In any case, Alanik did not appear in the slightest bit uncomfortable about being put on the spot like that. We had a big talk about faith, risk-taking and the duty of the individual towards their community, Alanik said. Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. So did a lot of other people from what he could see. And you were scolding me and Zorian for not taking things seriously just a little while ago, Kale scoffed. It's the truth, Alanik said. Rather than just refuse the creature, I asked it why I would ever agree to such a deal. The consequences would be so apocalyptic, especially for Cyoria, that I couldn't imagine how this would be a good idea. Even if I was selfish to the extreme and only cared about myself, the primordial was a threat to all of humanity. Oh, I asked him the same thing, Orisa interjected. He said he had no intention of destroying the world or menacing humanity. All he wanted, he said, was to be free and to free the rest of the imprisoned primordials as well. He would only destroy those who tried to prevent him from achieving those two goals. Huh. Well, it said no such thing to me, Alanik said. Probably because it knew I would not believe that. Instead, the primordial countered my concerns by telling me that the gods had left numerous contingencies in regards to primordials, should they ever successfully escape. If I truly had faith in the gods, it said, what was the harm in setting it free? The contract would be fulfilled the moment it was out of prison, even if it died immediately afterwards. I should have faith in the divine and their works, in which case there was nothing wrong with taking the deal, releasing it out of its prison and then watching it die immediately afterwards. Do these contingencies of the gods truly exist? Zorian asked. He heard nothing about that, but Alanik was a priest, so... I don't know, Alanik admitted. Even if they did, it is said the gods imprisoned primordials because they had trouble truly killing them. If the gods were incapable of dealing with them in person, I rather doubt a mere contingency could do it. Clearly this Panicseth did not believe this either, otherwise why would it even make the offer? We then got into a lengthy philosophical discussion about what constitutes true faith and various other things. I doubt you really want to hear about that. Maybe later, Zack said. Orisa, you said you also talked to Panicseth about what he'd do once free? Yes. Aside from what I already said, I think he alluded to these divine contingencies Alanik spoke about at one point, she said. He mentioned that in the process of tearing himself free from his cage he would likely end up weakened and grievously wounded, and that it would take him centuries to fully recover. During that time he would just hide somewhere and wait until he was fully healed. He was suggesting that I had no reason to care about his goals, because by the time he was ready to make his move, I would have died a long time ago. After some more back and forth, they confirmed some details with the other members of the group. For instance, it seemed that nobody had been presented with an image of a person that had died before the time loop had begun. In fact, the primordial didn't even bother copying living relatives, if the temporary looper hadn't interacted with them within the bounds of the time loop. This led some credence to his claim that he couldn't read minds and just relied on seeing everything that ever happened in the time loop. This done, they turned to the last three people who had spoken to Panicseth at any real length. Svim, Kiran and Night Dream had all asked similar questions, however. They wanted to know the details of what the contract with Panicseth actually entailed. Thankfully, this appeared to be a topic that Panicseth was really eager to talk about. So if I understood you three correctly, the contract is as follows, Zorian said. You make a death pact with Panicseth, swearing that you would either free him within a month or die trying. He then takes your soul and incarnates it in the outside world. That is to say, he creates a brand new copy of your body in the real world at the start of the month, in effect physically ejecting you out of the time loop. Included in the created body is some kind of kill switch that will kill you if Panicseth is still imprisoned at the end of the summer festival. Yes, Night Dream said, her magically produced voice clear and smooth. It doesn't matter whether you tried your best or why you failed. If Panicseth isn't free by the end of the deadline, the death seal activates and kills you. No excuses. And if Panicseth is freed at any point before the deadline, this kill switch dissolves into nothingness and you are free to do whatever you want? Zorian asked. Yes, even if Panicseth dies, our part of the agreement is done, Svim confirmed. I asked several variations of that question just to be sure, and he always answered the same. We only needed to get him out, nothing more. Our original selves were not part of the agreement either, and would not suffer if we failed in our task. Probably because their bodies hadn't been created by Panicseth, so he cannot place his death seal thingy on them, Kiran remarked. Even if he wanted to make them die with us, he cannot. What stops you from taking the deal and then working against Panicseth? Assuming you don't mind dying in a month, of course, Alanik asked. When I asked a question along those lines, the shape-shifting asshole immediately ended our conversation and sent me back to the group, Kiran said. I guess he really didn't like that question. From what I can tell though, the answer is nothing. Nothing stops you from doing just that. Then, Kale said hesitantly, do you think that's Silver Lake? Kiran let loose a short, loud laugh. Boy, get real, he told Kale. Do you think a selfish, self-centered bitch like that would agree to sacrifice herself for our sake? For anyone's sake? Kale sighed, saying nothing. A quiet murmur rippled throughout the entire group as they discussed the topic among themselves. Zorian listened to it with half an ear while lost in his own thoughts. Truthfully, now that he had heard about other people's experiences with Panicseth, her choice was predictable. It wasn't that they had trusted her because they had thought that she was better than this. They had just never realized making a deal like this was even an option. If Zorian had known about this before, he would have been the first one to veto any involvement with her, no matter how useful she could have been to their efforts. And she had been very, very useful. Without any exaggeration, she was one of the pillars of the group on which their entire plan rested. Saurian wasn't even sure if they could do this without her. Certainly, without Silver Lake, their current exit plan was completely unworkable. I have to agree with Kiran, Olenek said solemnly. Silver Lake did not keep her attitudes hidden, so this decision should not surprise anyone here. You heard what everyone said on this meeting. The Primordial offers people a guaranteed way to save their lives, as opposed to the uncertain odds of survival that we can offer her. She probably wouldn't care if every single person in Cyoria ended up dead as a result of Panicseth's release, and it might be centuries before the wider consequences of his unsealing became apparent. Plus, there is no telling what kind of prize the creature offered her to entice her further. She was also clearly already interested in primordials even before the time loop. Including Panicseth's prison specifically, Saurian said. She might have felt more confident about being able to come out on top when dealing with one of them. But she's immortal, right? Taven protested. Shouldn't she take the long view in this? Even if Panicseth takes several centuries to start wrecking everything, she'll still be alive by that point. You have to look at it from her eyes, Zack said. He had calmed down greatly from his initial rage, and was now thinking much more rationally about the situation. What's the alternative? Dying immediately because you couldn't get out of the time loop? That's even worse. But if Panicseth remains sealed, her original self can continue to live in peace indefinitely, Taven pointed out. She's risking the long-term future of her original in exchange for a little more life for herself. I don't think she cares about that, Saurian said, shaking his head. That Silver Lake is not her. Yes. Did you ever notice she never created any simulacrums? Even when it would have been very useful. Zack pointed out. I don't think for a moment she was unable to learn the spell. And I don't think she would sabotage our attempts to escape from the time loop by not creating more skilled manpower. I think she's one of the people who can't use them because they would freak out when they realized their lives were fleeting and do something stupid. Well, when you all put it like that, why did we ever agree to work with her in the first place? Kiran suddenly demanded, throwing his hands in the air in discontent. Yeah, one of Svim's academic friends piped in. She was a bad idea right from the start. Whose bright idea was to include her anyway? What was the alternative? Svim challenged, alternating his gaze between Kiran and the other speaker. Silver Lake was brought into the group because she had critical skills that no one else possessed. The only reason we got as far as we did was because we had her working along with us. Even if she betrayed us in the end, it's hard to say whether we would have been better off without her. No one had anything to say to that. Saurian, you're the only one Panicseth told anything related to Silver Lake, Zack said. Can you tell us anything else? All he said was that someone had already taken his offer, so convincing me didn't matter anymore, Saurian said. He was the only one Panicseth had felt the need to tell that. I had no idea what that meant back then, but when I saw Silver Lake was missing. Yeah, Zack said, clacking his tongue. Doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened. So what now? Now we have two hostile loopers to deal with once we get out of the time loop. Saurian had to admire Zack's spirit sometimes. Even now, with all their plans being thrown into total disarray, he was still confident they would get out of this alive. It was nice to have someone like that sometimes. Panicseth's statement was a little confusing, but I think that's right. He was implying that Red Robe had also taken his offer and made a contract with him in order to leave the time loop. Presumably, this is why he spent so much time optimizing the invasion. His very life depends on its success. Presumably, once outside, Silver Lake will work with him to make sure Panicseth's release goes off as smoothly as possible. Why does Silver Lake accepting his offer mean there is no point in convincing you, though? Kale asked. You'd think Panicseth would want as many agents as possible. Probably because every time he transports someone out the gate becomes barred again, Saurian said. Remember, the whole point of gathering the key was that the gate was inexplicably barred, even though it shouldn't have been. The controller has already left, Guardian of the Threshold told us. That probably means that when Panicseth got Red Robe out of the time loop, it got stuck. The same probably happened now. Even if Panicseth wanted to transport more than one person, he couldn't. But you still have the key, Ilsa pointed out. We do, Zack confirmed. So you can probably just unbar the gate again, Ilsa stated. Probably, Zack agreed. They'd have to be pretty stupid to take any of us into the Sovereign Gate again, Olenek said pitilessly. I would never do so in their place. All of us present refused that thing's deal, Kirin pointed out, a little incensed. Or maybe we were just too slow and Silver Lake hammered out her deal before we had a chance to do the same, Svim said. I agree with Olenek. Now that Silver Lake betrayed us, the pressure on the remaining people is all the greater. It's a pointless risk. Zorian watched the argument in silence, not knowing what to say. This was going to be a long evening. After finding out what everyone had experienced in the Sovereign Gate, Zack and Zorian departed from the Novita estate and went to ransack Silver Lake's dimensional refuge for any clues. Of course, Zorian fully intended to also steal any magical secrets or notable resources he found there. Since Silver Lake had betrayed them so utterly, he did not feel bad about robbing her blind in the slightest. Unfortunately, it seemed that Silver Lake's spite and paranoia knew no bounds. When they finally managed to subvert her defenses and break into her pocket dimension, they found it utterly wrecked. It had been reduced to a smoking crater for quite some time before they arrived, most likely because some dead man's switch had activated when she died and destroyed everything. Zorian left a couple of simulacrums to sift through the wreckage for anything of value, but he didn't have much hope they would find anything. The destruction was quite thorough. The only things that survived relatively intact was a curious arrangement of stones that was apparently responsible for powering her pocket dimension. He had long wondered how she was doing that, since the location itself could not support the dimensional magic she was using to isolate it from the rest of the world. Now he knew. Each of the heavy linking stones, which were built right into the walls of her hideout to disguise them better, had a matching counterpart deep in the underworld below her base. The underworld stones siphoned ambient mana from the dungeon and sent it straight into Silver Lake's hideout through the paired stones in the pocket dimension. He supposed that if he ever wanted to destroy Silver Lake's pocket dimension, he now knew a really easy way to do it. He just had to wreck the mana siphoning stones in the dungeon below her sanctuary and the whole place would soon fall apart on its own. In any case, with this matter currently being dealt with, Zack and Zorian turned their attention towards the next thing that had to be done as soon as possible. They had to go back to the Sovereign Gate and talk to the Guardian of the Threshold. There was danger in doing that, of course. However, it had to be done. They had to confirm their suspicions. First, they had to see if the Guardian would still be there at all when they came back, since it had gone missing when they had last left the Sovereign Gate. Secondly, they had to see if the gate really was barred again like they suspected. So, a lot of their speculation would be all but confirmed. Finally, they had to see if the Guardian could shed some light on what happened during their last visit. While it had seemed like nothing more than an automated puppet in the past, there was clearly something more complex going on in regards to that thing. Only the two of them would be going there this time, of course. Considering Panic-Seth completely ignored Zack the last time around and told Zorian he would not bother with him in the future, they probably wouldn't be seeing him on this visit. Even if they did though, Zorian was far less afraid of him now that he knew he couldn't just reach into his head and start editing things. Whatever restrictions the Primordial was laboring under, they clearly prevented him from coercing people into anything. When they entered the Sovereign Gate, they were relieved to see the familiar figure of the Guardian of the Threshold floating in front of them. "Welcome, Controller," the Guardian greeted. "So Panic-Seth didn't break everything with his little visit," Zack commented, loudly exhaling in satisfaction. "That's great. Finally some good news." "Yes," Zorian agreed. He turned towards the floating humanoid of light, giving him a complex look. What was this thing really? "Guardian, is the gate still open?" They waited for several seconds, wondering why it took the Guardian so long to answer that. Usually he was really prompt with his answers, only occasionally waiting while it looked up something in the background. As the seconds ticked by, though, they realized he wasn't checking up on things before giving them an answer. Instead, the Guardian ignored Zorian's question completely. "Oh. Hey Guardian. Is the gate still open?" Zack said, repeating Zorian's question. "No, Controller. The gate is barred," the Guardian immediately answered. Zack and Zorian shared a complex look with each other. On one hand, they just confirmed their speculation about what happened. This was good. It meant they were of the right track. On the other hand, "Guardian, why did you answer his question and not mine?" Zorian asked the glowing humanoid. But the Guardian ignored his question just like he did the previous one. In fact, Zorian realized that although the Guardian was facing them, he was subtly tilted towards Zack. It was like he was completely ignoring Zorian's very existence. Just like he had been ignoring the temporary loopers in the past. Guardian, why are you only responding to me and not him? Zack asked, a bit of frustration bleeding into his voice. I only respond to the controller, the Guardian stated placidly. I knew it, Zorian said quietly, followed by a small sigh. Zack stared at the Guardian, getting visibly more and more upset as time went by. Zorian just felt a sinking feeling of defeat instead. When it rained it poured. This is bullshit, Zack stated angrily, pointing with his finger at Zorian. He entered this space on his own by activating his marker. Only a controller can do that. Yes, the Guardian agreed. He is an anomaly. Those happen sometimes. Something or someone has managed to get past the safeguards and disrupted the integrity of the mechanism. The anomaly can access controller privileges even though he is not one. I am unable to do anything about that at the moment, but do not worry. The mistake will be corrected at the end of this cycle when the world is recreated again. Lovely. Zorian did not need a detailed explanation to understand what the Guardian was implying. But why now? Zack demanded. How did you figure out he was the anomaly all of a sudden? He had been coming and going here for ages now. Yes. Regretful, Guardian said blandly. However, you have presented me with the key recently, which triggered a complete analysis of the existing situation. During this inspection, the anomaly was identified and correction procedures were scheduled to be performed at the first possible opportunity. Why? Zack asked. What is it about the key that triggers this? Activating the key signifies that something has gone wrong with the time loop mechanism, the Guardian answered as if that was the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, a thorough check of everything is in order. It does. You never mentioned this when we asked you about the key, Zack stated accusingly. The Guardian ignored the statement. Zorian was actually a little taken aback by this, since it meant the Guardian had probably kept them deliberately in the dark about that when they had talked to him in the past. He supposed it made sense. The key was a security measure meant to confirm the controller's identity. It made sense not to discuss the details of its operation unless the Guardian felt he had to for some reason. What about those privileges I claimed then? Zack asked. What does that get me? It affirms your status as the one true controller and locks out all the other pretenders that may be walking about, the Guardian said. What? Zack protested incredulously. That's it? No new functions or abilities or anything like that. As a controller, you already have all the privileges, the Guardian told him. You have simply ensured others do not infringe on this. Why can Zorian even access this place then? Zack demanded. Hey. He is an anomaly, the Guardian said. These privileges are such a ripoff, Zack complained. It doesn't even do what it's supposed to properly. I'm sorry, the Guardian said, sounding honestly apologetic. He's a very frustrating anomaly. And thank the gods for that, Zorian thought. He wasn't panicking strangely enough. He didn't know why. Maybe because he already faced a very dire situation today and was rather emotionally drained at the moment. But finding out he was going to be deleted at the end of the month only brought a dull mixture of dread and determination to his mind. So what if Silver Lake had betrayed them? So what if Panic Seth was actively working against him? So what if he would get erased at the end of the month? Hadn't they already planned to make an escape attempt in this restart? They just had to make sure it worked. He looked over at Zack, who had stopped arguing with the Guardian and was instead looking at Zorian like he was a dead man. A mixture of horror and guilt was etched clearly into his face. Don't beat yourself over this, Zorian told Zack. His voice was so calm and even he was surprised how confident he sounded. There was nothing else we could have done. You heard what the Guardian said. The moment we presented the key to him, I was marked for erasure. It was always a given that we would do that the moment we gathered all the pieces. We should be grateful it was so difficult and took us that long to do it, or else we would have ended up in this situation at a much earlier and far less favorable restart. But Zorian, Zack protested. This just means I need to get out of here before this month ends. It's the same situation the rest of the group is laboring under, really, Zorian said. Don't tell me you've already given up? No, Zack said slowly, taking a few deep breaths. Damn it. I really hate this. Ask the Guardian if the key still works. Can you unbar the gate again? It turned out. Do you want to do it now? The Guardian asked. No. Zack shouted at it. No. Do nothing until I tell you, you useless thing. As you wish, the Guardian said peacefully, completely oblivious to their emotional turmoil. There was a few seconds of silence as neither Zack nor Zorian said anything. Well, said Zorian finally. We should probably end this for now. We need to come here later to ask more questions, but I don't think either of us is in the right frame of mind to do so at the moment. Yeah, I guess, Zack gloomily agreed. Suddenly, the Guardian started convulsing again. Oh, not this shit again. Zack protested in an exasperated tone. Zorian made no moves to exit the Sovereign Gate this time. He probably couldn't even if he wanted to, but this time he actually wanted to have a talk with Panic Seth, so he didn't even try. Interestingly, Panic Seth did not bother to separate Zack from Zorian this time around and simply possessed the convulsing Guardian in front of them both. The glowing humanoid erupted into a forest of blood-red branches and tentacles before shuddering and contracting into a more human-like mass. It then quickly shape-shifted into the same female form that it had chosen for Zorian the last time they spoke. It did so far quicker than last time, apparently having gotten more proficient with the process. It took a step forward, seemingly intending to walk over to them before pausing and stopping in place. Hello, Zorian, Panic Seth said in a pleasant female voice. We meet again. I thought you said you would not bother talking to me again, Zorian immediately pointed out. That it was a one-time offer. Bah, I told you it was just playing hard to get, Zack stated. Getting past the safeguards on this mechanism is not an easy thing to do, Panic Seth said. It is not easy for me to appear before you like this. I meant what I said last time, but I decided you are more interesting than I first realized. Last time you didn't even dare show your face in front of me, Zack said loudly in a challenging tone, folding his hands over his chest. As the controller, you are especially well protected from any tampering, Panic Seth said, shifting its attention towards Zack for a moment. And you can leave at any time. You do not require my help, nor am I able to stop you from leaving. You are of no use to me. But here you are showing yourself in front of me anyway, Zack pointed out. I need to conserve my power, Panic Seth said. Isolating you in a separate space is costly and unnecessary. I do not care if you hear us. The female form Panic Seth was wearing turned its attention back to Zorian, staring at him intently. You still have a chance to survive this, Panic Seth said. I have managed to stop the Guardian from rescinding all your controller privileges. Wreck the controller's mind as much as you're able, use the key to unbar the gate, and I will incarnate you in the outside world. I do not even ask that you make a contract with me. Grievously sabotaging the controller and preventing him from exiting the time loop will be payment enough for your salvation. Zack actually floated a few steps back when he heard that. You don't want me as an agent? Zorian asked, frowning. I already have 2 of them. That's more than enough, Panic Seth said. If I can ensure that the controller dies here when the time loop collapses upon itself, it will be far more valuable to me than any additional number of agents. Neither Zack nor Zorian said anything for a few seconds, but Zorian was furiously thinking about things. Panic Seth was so desperate to take Zack out of the picture. That probably meant this entire time loop had been made specifically to help him find a reliable way to stop Panic Seth's release. Even if Zack could not remember so, the 2 of them were mortal enemies. Before I helped Zack gather all the pieces of the key, you were already winning, Zorian realized. You had already sent one of the temporary loopers out as your agent, and Zack had mostly forgotten his mission to stop you. He only had vague feelings to guide him in what he must do. Even if he figured out how to come here, the gate was barred and he couldn't leave. Yes. It would have been better for me if the key had never been found, Panic Seth admitted readily. However, I am the very embodiment of adaptability. I do not blame you for looking out for your best interests. I simply recruited one of you as my agent, thinking that was the best way to make use of the situation. It was only later that I found out how capable you are at mind invasion, and how the original plan could still be salvaged. You didn't know that before? Zorian asked. I'm always watching, Panic Seth said. Everything everywhere. But my consciousness is a lot like yours, in that I can't pay attention to every little detail I see. When you observe an anthill, you perceive a lot, but can you really remember what one particular ant does at any point of time? But I remember it all with perfect clarity and I can review it all later as I wish. Just like you can remember things with perfect clarity when you want to. We're a lot more alike than you might think, Sorian. The female shape Panicseth was using as his avatar smiled. It was a bright, sunny smile that was probably meant to put him at ease but which Sorian found inexplicably terrifying. We're both trapped in this cage doing anything we can, even distasteful things, in order to get out, Panicseth continued. Do you think I want to destroy your city? Its destruction is simply an unfortunate consequence of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I never asked your kind to build a city around me. Just like you are willing to kill your outside self to live, I am willing to obliterate everything around me to get free. It is not my fault my fatality count is higher than yours. I will die if I don't get out of here in time, Sorian pointed out. You won't. The cage that binds me is torture you can barely imagine, Panicseth countered. Imagine being entombed for centuries, alive but starving and thirsting and unable to move a finger. If that was your fate, would you not do anything in your power to get free? That was a good argument, actually. Sorian had nothing to say to that. And then there is him, said Panicseth, suddenly pointing towards Zack. Me? Zack protested. I'm just sitting here quietly listening to you two talk. What about me? I am heavily restricted in regards to the controller and cannot speak about things freely, but I can tell you this. No matter what you think about that person, no matter how friendly he seems, you are ultimately enemies. In the end, one has to kill the other. That's bullshit. Zack exploded. What the hell do you mean by that? He is good at pretending, Panicseth said, not even bothering to look at him. However, you should have noticed the signs by now. Don't let your emotions overpower your reason. Angry and ignored, Zack tried to ram himself into Panicseth's form, even though he knew no fighting was possible here and that this was probably a bad idea. Panicseth's form simply blurred for a moment, causing Zack to harmlessly pass through it. I have said all that needs to be said, Panicseth said. Make the right choice, Sorian. You have until the end of the restart to make a decision. I will be waiting. Then they were outside, back in their real bodies. They hadn't even activated the exit function in their marker. It was another thing that the Primordial could apparently do on its own initiative. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Zack raged, throwing around everything in the vicinity to vent his frustration. Sorian winced when one of the sensitive instruments that the facility staff used to study the Sovereign Gate impacted the nearby wall and broke apart. That was going to be a real bitch to explain to Cranton. Damn it all to hell. Why has everything suddenly going so wrong? Zack, you really need to work on your temper, Sorian said, thrusting his hand towards another device Zack just threw across the room. It immediately ceased flying through the air, stopping just before it hit one of the cabinets. Zack paced around the room angrily for a while, not saying anything but thankfully no longer destroying expensive equipment either. After a while he marched up to Sorian with heavy, purposeful steps and grasped him by the shoulders with both of his hands. Sorian, he began, you don't really believe that nonsense Panicseth was spouting there at the end, do you? Sorian stared at him stony-faced for several seconds. He knew that there was something to Panicseth's accusations. Zack's mind, it clearly had been tampered with somehow. Maybe by Red Robe. Maybe by the angels when they had given him his task. Maybe by both. Everything pointed towards that conclusion. Even if Zack was genuinely friendly and wished him nothing but good, there could be all sorts of restrictions, compulsions or contingencies placed in there, just waiting for some trigger to activate them. Perhaps once they were out of the time loop, the smiling boy in front of him would suddenly turn hostile and try to kill him for no reason. He still remembered how quickly Princess switched from seeing them as mortal enemies to following one of them like an overgrown puppy, just because they managed to scratch her a little with her control dagger. However, he also knew it would be a mistake to say that out loud. For one thing, Zack just listened to Panicseth telling Sorian to scramble his mind in exchange for a ticket to outside. In light of that, any argument Sorian might use to convince Zack to let him rummage inside his mind would seem very suspect. No, Sorian said. I don't believe that at all. Zack stared at him for a second before finally letting go of his shoulders and straightening himself a little. Good, he said, patting Sorian on the shoulder in a friendly manner. That's good. We can't let that thing divide us like that. We need to trust each other now most of all. Right, Sorian said. He actually agreed with that. And by the way, You're the one explaining to Cranton why you totally trashed the room like that. Zack froze for a second and then looked around him, assessing damage. I guess you're right, he said with a groan. I really do need to work on my temper. Chapter 091. A path paid in blood. This isn't going to work. Zorian stopped staring at the pile of blueprints and notebooks in front of him and looked at the speaker. It was Svim. He and Olenek had snuck up to him while his attention was absorbed into his task and were currently staring at him expectantly. Zorian tapped his pen on the table a couple of times before throwing it aside and leaning back in his chair. Perhaps it would be a good idea to take a break. His work had stalled for a while now. I'm not sure I understand, he told his old mentor. We can't keep going like this, Svim clarified. This path we're on, it's not going to work. When we planned this out, we were counting on having Silver Lake on our side. Now we don't, and no amount of increased enthusiasm and minor adjustments is going to make up for it. I know you're still under the impression of what Panicseth told you, but something has to change. At this rate, we're simply blundering into an obvious failure. Zorian stared at Svim for a second before glancing at Olenek. However, the scarred battle priest was silent, simply staring back at him without saying a word. Clearly he agreed with Svim's words then. They had probably discussed things between each other before approaching him. He looked around the room instead of immediately answering. It gave him a way to stall and gather his thoughts, but he was also curious about people's reactions to the conversation. They were inside one of the Novita Estates rooms, and there were quite a few people gathered here. Most of them pretended to be absorbed into their own work, but Zorian could tell that all of them were paying close attention to what was happening. Well, except for Zack. His fellow time traveler was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his eyes closed, trying to sense the divine energies of his divine blessing and controller marker. Zorian was not sure why he was doing that, to be honest. Both he and Zack had already succeeded at perceiving these divine energies, and it was unlikely he would develop the skill much in what little time they had left before the end of the restart. On top of that, they had basically given up on trying to modify the temporary markers. There was little point to that now. He took a deep breath but resisted the urge to sigh. They had informed the whole group about their second encounter with Panicseth and what it meant for Zorian. Strangely, the group took another bout of bad news in stride. In fact, the knowledge that Zorian now shared fates with them seemed to significantly improve the mood of the group. He was one of them now, and the fact that he didn't panic and break down after finding out this was his last chance to live seemed to inspire them somewhat and calm their fears. They worked harder, grumbled less, and were less dubious about his motives and logic. For a while, he thought that would be enough. That with some renewed enthusiasm and some clever workaround they would be able to make up for Silver Lake's absence and proceed as planned. However, Svim and Olenek were right. This wasn't going to work. They needed a new plan. What are you suggesting? Zorian asked them. First of all, we should tell Cranton and his team that we're time travelers, Svim said. Zorian cocked his head to the side curiously. Not really what he was expecting to hear. Wouldn't that be rather counterproductive? Zorian asked. Cranton and his team have been remarkably cooperative with us, all things considered. If they knew the truth, I imagine their enthusiasm for helping us could only plummet as a response. I said we should tell them we're time travelers, not the full and total truth, Svim said. Truthfully, they already suspect this. The documents we are providing them with are too similar to their own existing work for that to escape their notice. They have been talking amongst themselves about our identity for a while now, and the most common theory is that we're literally from the future. It isn't that far from the truth, really. They actually hit upon such a crazy theory as the most likely one? Zorian asked, surprised. They're working in a time magic research facility, Svim said. Even though actual time travel is said to be impossible, the topic is likely to come up with some regularity among the staff. They are being paid to push the boundaries of time magic as much as they can after all. Zorian stayed quiet for a few seconds, mulling things over. He supposed the idea was workable, all things considered, and it might eliminate some of the inefficiencies they'd encountered when working with Cranton and his team. However, although this would be useful, I'm not really sure it would do that much, Zorian said finally. The facility staff is already working hard on the project of turning the Imperial Orb into a black room. Even with their limited information, they seem appreciative enough for the funding and opportunities we've given them. I doubt we could drive them to work harder with this. No, probably not, Svim agreed, propping his elbows on the table and folding his fingers into a triangle shape in front of him. This is merely an attempt to make them fine with the second step of the plan. Which is? Zorian prompted, feeling just a little bit apprehensive all of a sudden. Kidnapping everyone skilled and possibly useful and forcing them to work for us, Svim stated calmly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist. Zorian rubbed his chin in a frustrated manner before focusing back on the two people in front of him. Alanik was still not saying anything. They were both staring at him and waiting for a response. And just how? Zorian began. Through any means necessary, Svim said, cutting him off. Blackmail. Threats of death and bodily harm. Rampant use of mind magic. My mind magic is not that capable, Zorian said, frowning. The kind of work we need from them has never been done before. They would need to work with us to invent entirely new spells and rituals. I know, Svim said. I can't force someone to perform creative work for me with mind magic, Zorian pointed out. I don't think anyone can. At best we'd get a bunch of dazed zombies. They don't know that though, Svim said. Mind magic is terrifying even for mages, and few people are experienced enough to guess your limits. Ignoring that, what you can do is already terrifying enough for most people. If you demonstrated your memory manipulation abilities, most people would be very intimidated. Even I'm afraid of you sometimes, and I'm both familiar with your limitations and relatively certain you will not target me with your abilities. Finally, even if someone is not intimidated by your ability, you can always use your memory modification abilities as a limited retry button for convincing people. You've used your powers in that manner before, I am told. But only on enemies, stressed Zorian. And I'm very grateful you retain that sense of morality and restraint in regards to your powers, Svim said patiently. But we're running out of time, and desperate times call for desperate measures. Don't think we're just selfishly asking you to discard your ideals. This is a burden we're all willing to take upon our shoulders. Zorian gave him a surprised look. Somebody will need to keep this mass of resentful, forcibly recruited mages in line and focused on their duties instead of plotting our downfall, Svim said. That's going to be our job. Your job is simply to gather the people we need and intimidate them into cooperating with us, however reluctantly. Zorian stared at the man for a while, considering what he had been told. Svim was essentially saying that all or most of the other temporary loopers already agreed that this was an acceptable course of action. That they were just going to kidnap random people and force them into working for them. And here Zorian was thinking he was being too carefree about reaching for the darker, unethical methods to tackle their problems. Well, he said, I see we're turning into a proper villainous organization. All we need now is a mystical artifact that will allow us to remake the world in our image, and we're set to go. Svim's lips twitched slightly. If you really think about it, he said, a large group of people armed with knowledge of things to come and all the things we've gathered in the time loop would be more than enough to... Please don't, Zorian implored him. Just tell me once again how this is supposed to work. All right, Svim said, reaching into his bag and handing him a map with a bunch of locations marked on it. Colorful paper notes densely filled with text were pinned next to each of the indicated locations. Our main problem right now is that we don't have enough time, Svim continued after Zorian had a chance to glance at the map. The only way we're going to get that is by pushing our Black Room modification project to its utter limit. Therefore, we should drop virtually everything and focus on that. However, the biggest problem the project has is the lack of qualified mages to work on it. Most of us are not really qualified to help with it. However, this facility is not the only one of its kind. There are other facilities in other countries, and though they have not gotten as far as the one in Eldamar, their staff is no less qualified than Cranton and his researchers. They just suffer from a lack of funding and opportunities. The places on the map marked with blue upturned triangles were locations of all known Black Room projects in Altazia, Zorian realized. He knew about these, of course. They had been making use of their facilities for quite some time now. Not just in the sense that they were using them to extend their time in the restarts, either. They had long ago raided these places for any information about time magic, as well as handed them collected research notes from other facilities to see if they would come up with something novel when presented with such information. Although these initiatives were moderately successful, they had stopped yielding results by now, and so they no longer bothered with them. They simply made use of the facilities in each restart and then left them alone. Although these places were much smaller than the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria, there was a fair number of them. If they forcibly took all their staff, that would be a lot of people. Plus, there might be some useful equipment there now that he was thinking about it. If they were raiding these places for people, they might as well take everything that wasn't nailed down as well. So we just raid those places, taking everything and everyone in sight, Zorian said, clacking his tongue. What about those who just won't cooperate no matter what carrot and stick we use? Kill them. Push them through a portal to Blantyre and strand them in the jungle for a while, Svim said. I think most will reconsider after a few days, but if not, they can just spend the rest of the month there. And probably get eaten by a flying snake or something, Zorian thought, though he did not say it out loud. In any case, with this sudden influx of new people and with Cranton's hopeful acceptance of our time traveler story, we can then move on to the next step, said Svim, handing him another map. This one was a very detailed map of the underworld beneath Cyoria, centered around the time magic research facility. However, the facility in the map Svim gave him was larger than the one that currently existed beneath their feet. Much larger. It was a huge, sprawling complex that circled the whole like a giant torus and then extended into the surrounding land through a spider web of rooms and corridors. Zorian gave Svim a dubious look. There is no way this kind of development can be hidden from the city, Zorian said dubiously. Never mind Cranton and his reaction, this would bring the Eldamar military on our heads. Do we really have enough influence to make the city authorities overlook this sort of thing? Yes, that is certainly a problem. Svim tapped his fingers together and looked away uneasily for a second. We think we have a solution for that, though. I'm not going to like this, am I? Zorian asked rhetorically. Can it really be worse than the whole mass kidnapping thing? We should work with the Esoteric Order of the Celestial Dragon and its leaders, Svim told him. Zorian scowled at the suggestion. He had nothing but disgust and contempt for the cult of the World Dragon. At least Ibasans had a relatively understandable goal of sabotaging their national enemies. The cultists were traitors and seemed to operate purely on a mixture of delusion and insatiable greed for power. Most of the lower-level members didn't even know what exactly they were fighting for. Plus, he could never quite forget the sight of the shifter children they sacrificed in order to crack open Panaxeth's prison. He did not like the idea of cooperating with these people in the slightest. You can't be serious, Zorian told him, voice tinged with annoyance. I really am serious. And not just because they can help us make the city authorities look the other way while we rearrange the local underworld in our favor. With the loss of Silver Lake, we have lost our expert on the primordials in their cages. Aside from Silver Lake, the cult's leaders are probably the people most qualified to help us understand Panaxeth's prison, and how to exploit it to get out of the time loop, Svim explained. We already took everything they had, Zorian pointed out. In fact, they had been exceptionally thorough in raiding the cult for every secret they had. Zorian may have compunctions about delving into the minds of random people to steal their secrets, but he had no such compunctions about the cultists. He could not claim to have gotten every scrap of knowledge they had, since he could only look for things if he knew what to look for, but he was quite sure he got everything truly important out of them. What they already have, yes, Svim said. But not what they could have, if we teach them all we know and give them a chance to look at the problem with increased skills and perspective. Zorian's eyes widened in realization. You want to teach them? He asked, aghast at the idea. Everything, yes, Svim confirmed, nodding. We would not inform them about the time loop, of course, but other than that, we will bring them into our improved black room and teach them everything we can about divination, about dimensionalism, and about the structure of the primordial prison in the whole. We will then let them analyze the structure and either ask them to answer our questions, or you can just rip the answers straight out of their minds. It depends on how cooperative they are and what is more convenient. Zorian remained silent for a while. On one hand, he really didn't like the idea of teaching these people anything, especially since that would involve them being close by for several months, plenty of time for things to go seriously wrong. On the other hand, he found the idea of the cultists unknowingly helping them get out of the time loop so they could sabotage their plans in the real world to be rather amusing. And Svim was right that, other than Silver Lake, these people were the ones most familiar with the Primordials prison. They had been studying it for quite a while now in their attempt to open it, after all. There was, of course, a small matter of why in the world would the cult leaders agree to work with them on this. However, they were already considering kidnapping people and using blackmail and intimidation to make them cooperate, so this was probably not as difficult of an issue as it appeared. They just had to point out that the invasion could not possibly succeed unless Zack and Zorian allowed it to happen, and then prove their words with a demonstration of their power. He looked at Alanik, who had still not said anything up until now. "I'm surprised you're willing to entertain this idea," Zorian told him. "I was willing to work with Silver Lake, wasn't I?" Alanik said. "She may not have done anything particularly heinous in front of you, but I assure you she has done plenty of odious deeds in the past. I understand the necessity. It would be playing with fire, but it isn't like this is the first time we're doing that. Isn't it?" "Indeed," Zorian said quietly. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Alanik never really talked about his past with Silver Lake, or of his time before he became a priest. Zorian had long figured out by now that the scarred battle priest had been a very different man back then, and did a lot of things he later regretted, so he refrained from pushing the man on the topic. Alanik had been incredibly helpful towards him throughout all these restarts, and Zorian felt it would be ungrateful of him to dredge up painful memories and old grudges unless he really had to. If Alanik had some information about Silver Lake that he felt was important, he would have told them about it by now. After a while, Zorian picked up a pen and threw it at Zack's head. Though he had his eyes firmly closed, Zack immediately raised his hand and caught the pen out of the air before opening his eyes. "How much did you hear?" Zorian asked him. "Most of it," Zack admitted. "And?" Zorian prompted. "What do you think?" "I don't have any better idea," Zack said with a shrug. Neither did Zorian, in all honesty. Well, that wasn't entirely true. "All right," said Zorian, rising from his seat. "I guess we're doing this then. However, I think a slight modification is in order." "Slight, huh?" Zack said with a grin. "If we're going to get the maximum amount of time out of the modified Black Room, the extra manpower is not enough," said Zorian. "We need a dimensionalism mage of the highest caliber if we're going to get truly spectacular results. So, those don't exactly grow on trees," Zack pointed out, throwing the pen back at him. "Where are we going to find one of those?" Zorian caught the pen flying at him with practiced ease. "How attached are you to that crown we took from Quatakikal?" Zorian asked Zack with a knowing smile. Zack's expression immediately fell. "Oh, you can't be serious," Zack complained. "Oh, but he was. He really was." "Come on," Zorian told him, motioning him to get up from the floor. "Let's go talk to our favorite lich." Break. Somewhere in Eldamar, a field was burning. Two masked teenagers were engaged in a vicious fight against an ancient Ibasan lich, and the landscape around them was devastated in their passing. Once this had been a wheat field in full bloom, but it was now just an ashen land covered in craters. Broken remains of undead servants and golems littered the ground, and strange rock formations rose out of the ground in places where the two sides tried to entomb each other in solid stone. Somewhere out there, Zorian mused, a farmer was going to be very devastated when he saw what had happened to his harvest. This was the third time he and Zack had clashed with the lich like this in the last few days. However, this was fine as far as Zorian was concerned. He considered this to be simply a part of their negotiation with Quatakikal, rather than as a waste of time. They were proving to the lich that they were legitimate threats and that he should take them seriously. Earlier, when they had taken the crown from him in this restart, they had done it through an ambush and by employing something that could be dismissed as a mere trick. Through these fights, they were showing Quatakikal there was more to them than that. Quatakikal had never stopped looking for them all this time, of course. He had no idea it was Zack and Zorian who had stolen his crown, since they had worn disguises when they had ambushed him and covered their tracks extremely well, but he had somehow managed to find out about the existence of their group in general. He seemed to have identified Svim, Alanik, Ilsa and Kiran as the leaders of the group, possibly because they interacted with the authorities relatively often. He had tried to target them by ransacking their homes and such, but this hadn't been very effective. All temporary loopers had vacated their usual homes by now, and were not that easy to catch. Plus, he couldn't be too brazen about wrecking things or he would put his own invasion plans into danger. This sort of situation must have been rather frustrating for the ancient lich, because he had attacked them immediately when they had shown up in front of him again. He hadn't even given them a chance to speak. Rude. A giant, scintillating ball of red light screamed through the air towards Zorian. He thrust his hand at it, causing a conical wave of barely visible rainbow light to wash over it. It unraveled instantly, revealing a dimmer but much more dangerous arrow of green energies hurtling at his chest. The simulacrum standing beside him immediately thrust his arm into the path of the arrow, sacrificing it to shield Zorian from the blow. The arm exploded at the mere touch of the magical projectile, negating the attack but showering Zorian with a rain of metal shrapnel. Zorian didn't try to defend himself against the flying metal pieces, opting to keep casting his counterattack instead. The shrapnel was stopped by his shield, a faint honeycomb pattern momentarily becoming visible around him as it absorbed the attack, and then Zorian finished his spell. Nothing visibly happened, but this was because his projectiles were utterly invisible. A pair of circular discs of severing force made their way towards the Lich, who was currently busy dodging massive boulders and fireballs that Zack was sending his way. Beside them, Princess released a loud roar into the air with 6 of her many heads, the last 2 being busy chewing through the throat of a giant eagle she managed to snatch straight out of the air. The great bird hung limply from her jaws, its riders nowhere to be seen. The fight had been going on for long enough that an Eldamarian response group had reached them and tried to involve themselves into the fight. Unfortunately for them, neither group had appreciated their interference. Their eagle riders had lost at least half of their numbers. One could see the charred husks of their eagles and mages mixed among the wreckage of the battlefield if one looked closely enough. The remaining eagles now circled uneasily in the sky above, keeping their distance and simply observing things. Several sites in the distance were also smoking. These were the places where Eldamarian forces had tried to set up artillery positions to pick them off from a distance. Quatakikal hadn't liked that idea though, and after he had finished wiping them all out, they did not bother trying a second attempt at it. Zack shouted an order at Princess, and she roughly threw the dead eagle aside and disappeared. Well, teleported to be more exact. She reappeared instantly at Quatakikal's side, where she instantly tried biting and trampling him. Even the ancient Lich had trouble putting down such a large, regenerating beast. Especially when Zack and Zorian were there keeping him from being able to focus solely on dealing with her. Distracted as he was by the Hydra and Zack, Quatakikal did not notice the severing discs until it was too late and ended up losing one of his arms. This, in turn, placed him at an even bigger disadvantage and forced him to burn through a lot of his mana reserves to fend them off and stabilize himself. Now that he had no Imperial crown on him, his mana reserves were no longer quite as ridiculous as they once were. He could no longer just outlast them by default. Now Zack proudly wore the crown to battle, which meant it was Quatakikal who had to worry about a war of attrition. The battle continued on for another 5 minutes before eventually slowing down. Eventually, the two sides found themselves staring at each other over an expanse of barren land, waiting for the other to make a move. Zack and Zorian could press their advantage, of course, but that would only cause the Lich to flee. There was no point to that, really. The seconds slowly ticked by with nothing to show for it. The only sounds were occasional screeching of giant eagles circling overhead and Princess hissing at them and at Quatakikal in response. "Hey," Zack finally said, his voice magically distorted and his face hidden behind a blank white mask. He pulled the Imperial crown off his head and twirled it around his finger playfully. "Are you looking for this?" Quatakikal's response was to fire one of his signature red disintegration beams at him. However, Zack did not move a finger to dodge or block it. The beam just curved unnaturally around him and missed. "We might be willing to give it back," Zorian pointed out, his voice also distorted. Quatakikal cocked his head to the side curiously, saying nothing. "Or we can just continue this for another couple of days, I guess," Zack added. "I don't know about you, but I kind of enjoy these clashes between us. A bit of excitement to spice up the day, you know? So, you want to talk, huh?" Quatakikal observed. He looked up at the Eldamar eagle riders circling above. "This probably isn't the best place to do it, though." "Pick a time and place then," Zack said. "Just don't keep us waiting for too long. We're on a bit of a time limit here. You drag your feet too much and we'll just keep the crown and be done with it." Quatakikal didn't bother answering him. He simply picked up a rock from the ground and squeezed it in his skeletal hand. Bright orange lines burned themselves into the surface of the rock before fading away. The Lich then threw the rock at their feet and then teleported away. Zorian picked the rock up. It was still warm and there was a time and address carved into it. Plus a single sentence at the end. "Don't be late."